Good afternoon. On January 11th, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is the UN's highest judicial body, heard arguments in the case brought by South Africa against the State of Israel, which accuses the Jewish state of quote unquote acts and omissions genocidal in character against Palestinians in Gaza. Israel, as most of us know, is a signatory to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Hamas, as a terrorist organization and not a state, could not be. This whole proceeding is laced with profound irony. As most everyone knows, Israel was attacked by Hamas on October 7th, not the other way around. This is an existential war for the state of Israel. The very term genocide was first coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who fled the Nazis during World War II and established asylum in the United States. The horrors of the Nazi atrocities were too vast to be able to be encapsulated in any of the then existent international jurisprudence during the time of the Nuremberg trials, which was at a point of considerable frustration for him. He then came up with the term genus, meaning race or tribe, and side, meaning killing, and worked vociferously for an international convention against genocide. In his perspective, this would be used to, quote, prevent future Hitlers. In his 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, he defined the term as intended, quote, to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of existential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The irony is that the plan to annihilate the Jewish state is a coordinated plan coming from all the proxies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah. And of course, the deepest irony is that the modern state of Israel was very much established after the horrors of the genocide of the Holocaust. We're very honored to have with us here today, perhaps one of the world's greatest scholars on international law, Professor Amichai Cohen. Professor Amichai Cohen is a member of the Faculty of Law at Ono Academic College. He earned his LLB from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and his LLM and LLD from Yale Law School. He is an expert on international law of armed conflict and human rights law. Ami Cohen has served as the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the Ono Academic College. He's been a visiting professor of law at American University, at Columbia Law School. He is also a visiting scholar at Cambridge University and at the Swiss Institute of Comparative Law. He's written many, many books and scores upon scores of scholarly articles. First of all, Amichai, it is indeed a profound honor and a privilege to have you with us here today. Can you give us an overview of the crime of genocide and what are the claims of South Africa against Israel?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, good evening for me in Israel. Let me start by saying up front that I think that the South African claim, perhaps we'll deal with it later, is more political than legal. So we will respect it, perhaps with the respect it does not deserve, in the sense that I will analyze the legal foundations of genocide, as you said, and try to build the legal claim that South Africa is making. However, I think we're a little more favorable to them than they deserve from their point of view, which is, I think, more political, as I said. However, I will engage with the with the legal analysis. So the crime of genocide, and as you said, as defined by Lemkin, is the crime of crimes of international law. And it is the crime of crimes because it is consisted of two pillars. The first pillar is the action. So there has to be some illegal action on a large scale. The Holocaust, of course, the killing of Jews was the action, but it does not have to be a killing. It can also be harm, physical or mental. It can also be causing conditions of life that are very hard on a group. But the most important pillar of the crime of genocide is the intent, the special intent. So this is what turns it into the crime of crimes. And the special intent has to be to destroy, to exterminate a group, an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. So there has to be a plan. And a plan is usually, it doesn't have to be exclusively, but usually it means that there is a state which intends to execute this plan. And so the South African claim tries to show the two conditions exist. So regarding the killing, there is an extensive description of the suffering in the Gaza Strip. Now, I want to be very clear. There is immense suffering in the Gaza Strip. War is terrible. The number of civilians killed, the amount of property that is destroyed, the fact that more than 1 million people, perhaps even 1.5 million people, had to leave their homes. This is terrible. This is not the question. The question is not whether it's terrible. The question is whether it was illegal. And perhaps we'll deal with it later. I'm not saying that there weren't any violations of international law. In the history of the human race, there has never been an armed conflict in which there were no violations of the laws of armed conflict. But the war itself is not full with illegal activities. No, it's but however, the South Africans framed it as illegal acts. But this is not enough. The jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and this has to be explained, is only regarding genocide. The International Court of Justice does not have any jurisdiction regarding Israel with regards to any violations of the laws of armed conflict, because Israel agreed in advance only to the jurisdiction of the court regarding genocide in the convention you mentioned. So the South Africans have to prove intent. They have to prove that Israel has a plan to exterminate, if not all the Palestinians, that at least a significant part of the Palestinian people, those living in Gaza. Now, this is what turns the discussion into something that is, to my mind, very far from a legal discussion. Because in order to prove something so, I would even say, preposterous as suggesting that Israel has a plan to destroy the Palestinians, not the Hamas, the entire Palestinian people, one has to completely ignore the fact that Israel is providing humanitarian assistance, that Israel tried to evacuate Gaza City as the first move of the war was to evacuate, to warn the Palestinian civilians, something which, of course, makes no sense if there is an intention to destroy them. But anyway, the South Africans had to ignore all that and build their case on a number of declarations, utterances, comments made by fringe and a little less fringe politicians, which were, and perhaps we'll discuss it a little later, these were misplaced comments. I have nothing to say for these comments. they should be condemned, but they in no way prove any plan by Israel to exterminate the Palestinian people. This, as I said, this is very far from a legal claim, the way it was framed. But anyway, that's the South African case in a nutshell.
All right. So it seems that inherent in the definition of genocide is the notion of intentionality. Just last week, the IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari said Hamas sees civilian deaths as a strategy. We see them as a tragedy. So when we're talking about this initiative, this operation in Gaza, um, it seems to be abundantly clear to me from everything that the government of Israel has been doing to try to mitigate the suffering of the average Palestinian that this is not targeting Palestinians, but it's targeting the leaders of Hamas. Um, so, what would South Africa have to gain by making these claims? Is this simply a
So,
politicization of the
okay,
term?
so let's speak a little about strategy here, because I think understanding the strategy is important. So when a party goes to court, to any court, perhaps there are, if there are Jews on the audience, there are probably also lawyers in the audience. So the strategy here, and especially the International Court of Justice, could be one of three strategies. The first one is to win the case on the merits. I actually believe that the South Africans don't care so much about winning the case on the merits. It is very difficult to prove genocide in the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, in several cases in the past, has set a very high threshold for proving genocide. I will give just a very short example. In the Croatia versus Serbia case, the court has said that ethnic cleansing is not genocide. So even if a party declares it wants to ethnic cleanse an area from, in this case, the Serbians from the Croatians, this is not enough it is not sufficient for the intention for genocide, because you have to have the intention to destroy, not the intention to ethnically. So it's a very high threshold, and I don't think the South Africans have even an intention, if I can use this word, to win the case on the merits. However, there could be a second strategy, and the second strategy is to win the provisional measures stage. So as we can see, the current decision, and I think there are rumors it will be published on Friday, this coming Friday, so day after tomorrow. So the court has said in several cases in the past that in order to order provisional measures, the threshold is much lower. The party requesting the provisional measures only has to show that they have a plausible claim. So proving that they have a plausible claim, of course, is a much lower threshold. And the court has given several orders in the past in the context of genocide. We'll perhaps speak about the orders later, but this is a second strategy. So to create pressure on Israel by asking the court to order this is the main request of the South Africans, immediate ceasefire. So this is a second strategy. The third strategy, and perhaps this is a strategy of the South Africans, has nothing to do with the court. The court is only the platform to create political pressure on Israel, and we can see what's going on when parties are joining the case. Now, at this stage, there is no practical impact for parties joining the case. It's just joining the bandwagon effect. So countries are joining, and the South Africans and the Palestinians, I think hope that this will create pressure on Israel and specifically on Israel allies in the West, not so much about the US, which I think is firm now in its support of Israel, but on other countries that are perhaps weaker in their support, and there are internal divisions within them regarding the support. So we can see that, for example, according to the latest polls, there is now a small majority of Germans opposing the German support of Israel. So although the politicians are behind Israel, in the public, it's more complex. So this might be the third strategy. So to create political pressure and just using the court as a platform. Now, we understand that the International Court of Justice is not exactly a court, and perhaps we can speak about it later. So perhaps this is the real strategy of the South Africans here, not exactly to prove any intention or commission of genocide, but just to create pressure on Israel.
Can you explain, Amichai, the difference between the justification of Israel's persecution of the war on legal and on moral and ethical grounds?
So
What is
there is an issue that carries a lot of attention in the media, I think, and also in legal blogs, the discussion around it, about the cumulative civilian harm. So the total number of civilians, Palestinian civilians, that were killed in Gaza. Now, no one exactly knows the numbers because, first of all, we can't trust or have confidence in the numbers published by the Palestinians. But even if we believe the numbers, which are at between 23,000, perhaps 25,000 Palestinians, of course, we don't know how many of them are Hamas terrorists and how many are real civilians. And the number of children and women here is not a proof of anything because it depends what age of the children, who do you count as a child, and never mind. But let's assume for a second that there are many, many civilian deaths. And this is something I do not argue with. As I said, war is terrible and many Palestinian civilians died, clearly. But as a legal matter, this is actually doesn't prove anything about the legality of Israel's activity. The way international law looks at a conflict is first it asks whether the use of force is justified. And in this sense, it's clear that Israel, it's clear to me at least, and I think most legal scholars agree, Israel was justified in commencing the war. It's a self-defense after, as you said, the terrible events of October 7th. Once war has started, then the laws of armed conflict kick in. And the laws of armed conflict look at the case, at the civilian harm on one by one regarding the operation. So operation by operation. So the question is, how many civilians were killed in a specific bombing? There is a rule of proportionality, which says that the number of collateral damage, civilian harm to civilian cannot be excessive with compared to the military advantage gained by the attack. But this is on an operation by operation basis, not the entire war. The claim that is made in the newspapers by scholars, by some politicians, is that the number of civilians that was killed in total, not on specific operations, is too much. Too many Palestinian civilians were killed. This is not a legal claim. It's more a moral claim, saying that too many civilians were killed. Now, if it's a moral claim, I think the question of responsibility should be discussed. So who is responsible for the number of civilian deaths? As I said, I do not argue with the fact that many, many Palestinian civilians were killed. The question is, who's responsible for it? And I think, once again, not even as a legal claim, but as a moral claim, it's clear to me, at least, that the main culprit here are the Hamas. The Hamas built their entire strategy. Their entire strategy is acting from within civilian population. They turned Gaza into an enormous human shield. 2 million civilians serve as human shields of the Hamas operation, which is from tunnels under Gaza. We now know that hundreds of miles of tunnels were dug under the Gaza Strip. So the question is the question of responsibility, and it's clear that the Hamas is responsible. By the way, it's also clear, it's something people don't speak about because it's so ludicrous. If the Hamas now stops fighting and declares surrender, the fighting will immediately stop. There will be no more suffering for the civilians, but no one even suggests it. No one even thinks of the possibility. Now, it's not so far on. In 1982, if people remember, the Palestinians, and I'm not saying, I'm not a supporter of Arafat, but it has to be said to his credit. Arafat surrendered and said, okay, too much damage is done in Lebanon, I'm leaving. And he left for Tunis with hundreds of his supporters. So once again, I don't want to speak for Arafat, but it's a possibility. No one even suggests it in terms of the so morally. And I'm not even speaking, and we will perhaps have to speak about the kidnapped persons, which the Hamas still hold, and this is an ongoing crime against humanity that is going on in the in the area as we speak. It's not as if the Hamas is not doing anything. But I want to one more comment, if I may. I'm not saying that. Once again, I want to stress it, that during the war, Israel has made no mistakes or no violation. There were probably things that did not work exactly as they should have. It happens in every war. This is not the question, whether there are no violation. In this regard, I think the real question is whether Israel has the proper institutions to investigate and to correct and to put the blame on the people who have done something wrong. And I think Israel has these institutions, but perhaps this is for later.
Right. I'd love for you to discuss that and to discuss the inherent asymmetry between a war, between a state and a terrorist organization. Is a terrorist organization subject to the laws of armed conflict? What sorts of enforcement do we have against a terrorist organization?
So first of all, there is no question now. There was a question perhaps many years ago, but there is no question now that an organization like Hamas is subject to the laws of armed conflict. What do I mean when I say they are subject to the laws of armed conflict? I mean that any violation of the Hamas of the laws of armed conflict is a criminal violation of international law, and there is individual responsibility. Now, in most cases, this does not add a lot to the criminal status that the Hamas terrorists have already in Israeli law. So Israel, I think now the number I heard is about 2,500, between 2,500 and 3,000 Hamas members of Hamas, including persons, hundreds, that were caught on October 7th and several more that were caught during the operation, are held by Israel. And they will be put on trial. Many of them will be put on trial. There is now a very interesting discussion in Israel about how will the trial go on. For example, who will defend them, who will be their attorneys, right? So there is a question of, so this is an interesting question. But the question I think we have to think about is, what does international law has to add to Israeli domestic law? Those are criminals according to Israeli domestic law. Is there something that international law adds here? And I think that there is. I want to point to an interesting phenomenon that happened on October 7th. Israel is used to be a party that is usually criticized based on international law. So when people speak about international law in Israel, they usually speak about what did Israel do wrong this time, right? So, and then there are these claims about occupation, etc. This time on October 7th, actually international law, I'd like to frame it this way. International law assisted the world in digesting what happened on October 7th. So October 7th was such a terrible occurrence that people had a hard time, people around the world, not of course Israelis, people had a hard time in understanding what happened. And international law here, framing it as crimes against humanity, war crimes, it assists people in digesting it because it allows them to compare it to other events in history. So you can think about Rwanda. You can think about what happened in Bosnia. We can think about similar cases by using the legal terms. In this sense, I think it's also important. Of course, this as time progressed, then more and more people started criticizing Israel based on international law until we reached the peak of saying Israel committed genocide. But let's speak about the early stage here. So the way of thinking about Hamas, not only as committing crimes in Israeli domestic law against Israelis, but as violators of international criminal law, is important, because what international criminal law says is that there are crimes in which it's not only a person who's the victim, and it's not even a state which is the victim. It's the entire world which is the victim of these crimes. The order, the world order is the victim. And this is why we define them as international crimes, because the entire world has to respond to these crimes. And I think this frames the correct way in which we should look at the Hamas. The Hamas is not committing only crimes against Israelis. The Hamas is undermining the entire world order here in taking hostage not only 240 Israelis, but 2.5 million Palestinians. People were taken hostage by the Hamas. This is a crime against the entire humanity. This is why we call them crimes against humanity. The world cannot operate when such organizations are operating and with complete disregard, not to international law, but to humanity itself. This is why I think thinking about it in international law terms is important. It adds to the issue.
Yeah, that's why I think it's incredibly important that Israel has responded to this case. Because as we see on our televisions every night, there's a barrage of images of killed and harmed Palestinian civilians. So, how do we preserve the international support of the community of nations at large when many people are confronted by this?
Yes. So we have to think about it, I think, in two ways. First of all, who do we care about? So when speaking about international law and international politics, and I'm in this business for for quite some time, you have to realize that many countries use international law for political gains. They care nothing about international law, and therefore the opinion of Russia or of certain countries in Africa regarding whether Israel violates or not international law is not so important. It's politically problematic, but it's not a legal question. It's a political question, and one should treat it as such. But I don't want to ignore the issue. The real issue is not there. The real issue is within Western democracies and the public support and the images, as you have said, and not only the images, but the actual suffering. There is, and I can't stress it enough, there is enormous amount of suffering in the Gaza Strip. It's terrible what is happening here. There, war is terrible. The question is, can Israel operate better? The answer is clearly yes. And I'm not, I take pride. I've never been employed by the state of Israel. Okay, so I allow myself to be critical sometimes. So although I believe that in general, Israel here is justified in the operation and in most of what it's doing, it could have done better. So I'll give just a small example. It could have provided, I think, the humanitarian assistance at the first stage more readily. There shouldn't have been, pressure from President Biden in order for the Israelis to provide humanitarian assistance. At the end of the day, everybody understood that humanitarian assistance will be provided. So the issue of, the American pressure was, I don't think it was required. Anyway, but it's just an example. And there are probably other examples of this, of this order. The real, and on some level, these images cannot be contradicted. So let's think about it this way. The scenes from the evacuation of Gaza City, where you would see tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands Palestinians moving, there is no convenient or nice way to show this. It will be terrible. But let's think of the alternative. What would have happened if Israel had not warned the Palestinians, and the evacuation of Gaza City would not have occurred? What would have been the consequences of this? The consequences would have been much more terrible than they were. And once again, as they were, the consequences are terrible. But the scale would have been completely different if the evacuation would have been unsuccessful. The humanitarian areas now, that there are claims, and we know that there are still bombing even in the southern part of of Gaza. Clearly, there are. I'm not speaking about the area in which the fighting goes on now, in Khan Yunis. We're speaking about the areas in which people, more than 1 million people, were evacuated to tents and tent cities, etc. Because there are operations of Hamas from within these areas, there is also an Israeli response. But without these areas, it would have been much more terrible. So indeed, there are still operations there, but it's completely different than having these civilians within the cities and within areas in which the army operates. So, you know, I understand, and there is no good way to paint a war. A war is terrible, but the alternative to what Israel has done is much worse. And I actually think that if you saw the discussions on the International Court of Justice on Friday, so the Israeli case, actually, I think the presentation was quite good of the ways that the government in Israel, by the way, it doesn't have a lot to do with the genocide case. It has more to do with the feeling you were speaking about of the terrible things that are happening. So what is Israel doing in terms of assistance? Israel is doing a lot. It's hard to compare to past events. Every war is different. But if, you know, just general comparison, what Israel does favorably compares to anything that has been done in recent decades in similar conflicts.
Right. Right. So you have actually defined for us the 3 pillars, I think, of international law when in warfare: proportionality, using the use of force as a means of self-defense, distinguishing between civilians and legitimate military targets, and precaution. When Israel pamphleted leaflets, knocking on the roofs, so what are the consequences if the International Court of Justice were to rule against Israel? Can they impose a ceasefire on Israel while some 200,000 Israelis from the north and the south have fled their homes, etc.?
So let's try to break down the possibilities. So the worst case scenario, which I don't think actually will happen, but we'll see on Friday, okay? So is that the court will actually order an immediate ceasefire. It has done so in the Ukraine versus Russia case, just a little more than a year ago. The court has ordered a ceasefire. Russia, of course, ignored it completely. But it was essential, I think, the decision of the International Court of Justice there was essential in the building of the international coalition imposing sanctions on Russia. So, as you know, there are many sanctions on Russia, and we have to be very clear about it. If even a fraction, even a small fraction of the sanctions imposed on Russia will be imposed on Israel, Israel will not be able to withstand such sanctions. But even if not, even if the court will order an immediate ceasefire, and Israel will say, this is a political court, we are not respecting this. Assume now an Israeli delegation approaches the government of Germany and asks to buy armaments, weapons for the war, because Israel does not build all the weapons, it manufactures all the armament, it doesn't, it has to buy internationally. It will be very difficult for Germany, from their own domestic laws, to sell to Israel armaments to fight a war in which the International Court of Justice just ordered to stop. It will not even get to a political decision. It will be halted within the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy will never proceed with these. So these are real problems Israel will face. However, I don't think that this will happen. In ordering Israel an immediate ceasefire when the Hamas are not a party and therefore will not stop, will not release the kidnapped persons, will continue fighting, it doesn't make sense. I actually think that there is also always a chance, very slim chance that it will actually be done. If anything will be ordered by the court, it seems to be more in the realm of Israel has to provide perhaps more assistance in the meantime. Keep in mind, it's only an interim measure. It's not the final ruling of the court, which will be years in the future. It's only an so perhaps something in the area of allowing more in terms of safe zones, etc., which is less problematic to Israel. Perhaps something in the area of incitement to genocide. So for Israel to stop these utterances and declarations by, as I said, Israeli politicians who are unable to keep their mouth shut, which I think would actually be beneficial for Israel, such an order. It will be, I personally, I would welcome such an order. And perhaps even less. So some people, there is a Myanmar case regarding the Rohingya genocide, in which the court has simply ordered Myanmar not to commit genocide, which means nothing because Myanmar does not think it commits genocide and Israel does not think so too. So perhaps something in this area. So it depends a lot on the question of what will the court do. This is on the practical level. There is, however, a softer impact to the decision of the court. If the International Court of Justice will say it's a plausible claim that Israel commits genocide, it's a plausible claim, by itself, this will fuel criticism of Israel. It has an impact. It's not a direct impact. It's not as if immediately something will happen. But it has to do with the general criticism of Israel, once again, in Western democracies, which Israel relies on for support. And this will be problematic. And in this sense, perhaps, do we have a minute? I want to explain just something in short. So this court, this International Court of Justice, does it, is it a court? Is it not only politics? I read that Alan Dershowitz has just been interviewed today and said it's all politics, don't pay any attention. Well, some justices on the International Court of Justice are from China and Russia and Lebanon and Morocco and, countries like that. And in these cases, we don't think that they are independent, right, in their judicial decisions. But the International Court of Justice also has justices from the United States and from France and Germany and Japan and Australia, countries in which judicial independence is part and parcel of the foundations on which the country is built. So it's also important to look at the division of opinion between the justices. So if the justices that will be in support of orders against Israel will be those justices that come from Somalia and from Morocco, then this might not have such an effect. But if the court will be unanimous, or not unanimous, but there will be a very, very strong majority against Israel, this might create more problems to Israel. And just one last note, it's clear that the Chinese and Russian justices are not independent, but it still doesn't say where will they go. Because although China and Russia are not pro-Israeli in the current conflict, Russia and China also don't want the court to be filled with claims against genocide, because the next in line is China. Russia is already there. China regarding the Uyghurs in the in East China, in West China. Also, there's a claim. So they don't want genocide cases to be. So it's not clear, even if it's only political. It's not clear where will they go.
Okay. So if there might be this ruling of a plausible claim of the crimes against genocide, how will that affect Israel's ability to fight future conflicts? We are looking at Hezbollah in Lebanon.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy has already said that Italy is not selling arms to Israel since the beginning of the conflict. This is one country, and Israel does not buy a lot of arms from Italy. But as I said, Israel relies for its existence on international support. International support does not mean that Israel has to act by any, the most extreme view of international law. But Israel has to preserve the support, for example, in the US, and I think a lot is being done, of the US armed forces, perhaps lawyers within the US armed forces, of the Pentagon, the people at the Pentagon. There has to be an ongoing understanding between Israel, and it's being done. These are things that are being done, of delegations of Israeli officers that came to the US during the war and explained, and the same with the UK and France. So they are ongoing. The question is whether Israel will be able to preserve the core of international support within these countries. And here I'm turning the question to you. So you have to tell us, or me, or Israelis, in terms of you and the audience here at the webinar, what is needed more in terms of doing on the ground and in terms of public relations. So these two issues, whether it's an Israeli problem or an American problem, this is something in which I think the expertise is at your end.
Right. Well, one of the things I think is incumbent upon us is to keep the images of October 7th alive. I mean, there would be absolutely no war if October 7th hadn't occurred. And I think that we have to do that. I want to know from you, what does the averages really feel about the moral legitimacy of the war and of the IDF today?
In Israel?
Yeah, in Israel.
The question of Israel, the political question of Israel, if you follow Israeli news, is now more regarding the kidnapped person. So there is the internal disagreement now in Israel is not regarding the justification for war in general. It's regarding the disagreement, and it's a growing disagreement. It's not affecting the operations yet, but you can see it progressing, of the fact that some segments of Israeli society feel that the aims of the war are not anymore the contradiction between saving the kidnapped persons, which are there for 109 days, and dismantling the Hamas. There is a contradiction there, and the state is going against the Hamas and giving up, perhaps, as I have to be more careful here, and not doing enough in terms of saving the kidnapped person. So this is the main criticism that is in Israel. I'm not supporting this view, but one has to realize it's there, and it's a growing feeling within Israeli public. So just yesterday, the kidnapped families of the kidnapped persons did not allow the Knesset to discuss issues. They entered into the Knesset and they didn't allow them to discuss. Today, they blocked the Kerem Shalom crossing from humanitarian assistance, providing humanitarian assistance. It's a growing event in Israel. This is the main disagreement, I think, now within the Israeli society regarding the war.
Right. Yeah. Do you believe that Israel is under more international scrutiny and the IDF than most armies in the world?
I think this is not, this is uncontested, that Israel is under more scrutiny. From the beginning, one has to realize that this was a war in which the social networks were involved from the first second. So the Hamas strategy was to internationalize the conflict by using the social networks, right? They filmed everything, and everything was on the social networks from the first second of the conflict, and it's still so now. So it's a very open conflict, and of course, it's happening. The war is conducted by a democratic country in which there is free press and the ability to convey the images, and there is the background, you can call it anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli feelings, or just general scrutiny of Israel for other reasons, and the background criticism of Israel regarding the occupation, etc., etc. It's clear that the IDF is operating under higher scrutiny, I think.
Right.
It does not mean
right.
that Israel doesn't have to follow international law. Nevertheless, this is no justification for any violation. It's just that there is more criticism.
Right. We have so many questions that have come in. And maybe if we can have you for a bit longer, because this is, to me, unbelievably fascinating. I am wondering if you could just explain Israel's own mechanisms for those that violate the laws of armed conflict, those 18-year-old, what kind of mechanisms does Israel have in place?
So actually, this is something I was involved with almost 15 years ago. There was a commission in Israel which was formed in 2010 after the Marmara incident, the flotilla incident. And the commission there, the main thing it did is look at the way Israel investigates suspicions or allegations of violations by the IDF of operations. And what they did is create an independent system. It operates out, it's a military investigative body, but it's outside the chain of command. It's completely outside of the chain of command. It's built with reservists and people that are not in the current chain of command of the military. And once a military operation begins, this is immediately kicked in. So this institution is immediately formed and it's under operation now. And this institution conducts quick investigations. It's not criminal investigations, it's factual investigations of whether there is a need for opening a criminal investigation in specific cases. And it acts completely independent of the military chain of command. And also, it doesn't need there is no need that claims will be submitted to it. It looks at what is going on, and then it takes, suspicious cases or cases in which it seems that there is a need to investigate, and it looks at them. Now, the way, and this is actually a system that has operated quite well. It creates a good balance, I think, between the need to investigate allegations and the fear that too many criminal investigations are harmful for the morale of the troops. You can't open a criminal investigation with every allegation. Nobody knows the credibility of allegations, etc. So this system, which I think also, which was formed and is operational and was operational also in previous operations, provides the correct balance and the correct independence of investigation and effectiveness, of course, of investigations. Only after we'll see the results, I think, after the war in terms of actual cases. But I already know of operational conclusions that were reached, because this system, as I said, it's not a criminal system. It's a system that looks at what happened, and if there are mistakes, it looks at correcting these mistakes. And some corrections have already been made during this current war.
Okay. If we could just have you a little bit longer. I mean, to me, this is a treat.
You don't have to apologize, Sarah.
Right. And I'm going to have my esteemed colleague Joseph Epstein read some of the questions, and in particular, the very esteemed Nicholas Rostow had written in a question that I think is very interesting. Joseph?
Thank you, Sarah. So one of the questions we had was that the ICJ operates in a fashion not similar to the US domestic court. So many judges, that means, take instructions from their government. Judges also subject to pressure from the UNGA, which with the Security Council elects judges. So in this kind of case, people know Hamas is, a terrorist organization and are not above killing judges. Do you think that these types of bodies could be intimidated?
Perhaps, but I want to divide it to two questions. Okay, first, the question of intimidation. Bear in mind, these same judges have ruled against Russia. Okay, have ordered Russia to stop. And if I were a justice, I'm not. I don't have any plans to be. But if I were a justice and I would look at the, danger, possible danger, I would be more frightened of Vladimir Putin than of Yahya Sinwar. Okay, so just this is for the intimidation part. Regarding the political part, as I said, it's clear that many of the justices take orders from the governments, but there are several justices from countries, as I said, in which judicial independence is important. And here I want to add something to what I said before, and it's regarding the appointment of Justice Barak as the ad hoc Israeli judge. Of course, Israel had the right to appoint ad hoc justice, and they put Barak on the stand. So what does it mean? What does it signal? What's the symbolic value here? Apart from his contribution and his knowledge of international law. So Barak was demonized last year by the Israeli government as the architect of the constitutional revolution in the 1990s and then since then. So he is a symbol of an independent judge who speaks truth to power and is not afraid of the political government. And I think by sending him to the court, I don't know if it was intentional, but the signal, the symbol, once again, to these justices that come from countries in which judicial independence is important, is very clear, is that Israel has sent a justice who has withstood political pressure. And what Israel signals is that it doesn't want the justices to decide on a pro-Israeli basis. They want them to decide on a legal basis, objective legal basis. This is the way I think about it. And once again, it's very important, not only the decision itself, but who will be for and against the decision. When we speak about the impact of the court, the soft impact of the court, the origins of the justices is taken into account. It's clear that a unanimous or almost unanimous decision will be taken much differently than a divided court, in which, to be clear, that all these against Israel are from countries in which it's all politics.
Joseph, are there any other questions that you feel are important to ask Professor Coe?
There are quite a few, but it seems also that we've reached the end of our allotted time.
Sarah, I'll tell you what is possible. You can share my email with the participants, and if there are questions in which participants want to ask, send me an email. Please do. I don't promise to answer them tonight, but I will do every effort to answer the best I can.
Thank you so much, Michai. It is really a privilege and an honor to have you with us. You have a tremendous wealth and extent of knowledge, and this is a very, very pressing topic. Those of you who want to see these webinars continue, please go to emetonline.org. As you know, we do a lot more than our weekly webinars. We're on Capitol Hill every week, meeting with several staffers for members of Congress, if not the members themselves, and we write and publish at least one article a week. And we are trying very, very hard to keep on top of all of the very rapidly moving dynamics and parts in this war and in this particularly precarious situation that Israel has found itself up against. Please be sure to tune in next week, where we're going to have Dr. Gerald Steinberg from NGO Monitor, who's talking about some of the third-party payments to some of the NGOs and humanitarian organizations that have been very vociferous in their attacks against the Jewish state. And thank you so much, Amichai. It is really a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, and have a good afternoon.